Though special forces stay out of the limelight to preserve their secrecy, some information has trickled out over the years, but Delta Force is one of the most mysterious units in military history. Delta Force first came to the public's attention back in 1983 when its creator, Colonel Charles Beckwith, acknowledged its existence in a book, Delta Force, a memoir by the founder of the U.S. military's most secretive Special Operations Unit. In fact, Delta Force has been involved in countless, mostly highly classified missions. The unit officially dates to 1977, making them relatively young by U.S. military standards. But along with SEAL Team 6, they are one of the most important counter-terrorist groups in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Members of this crack unit will exist outside the usual U.S. Special Forces command structure.
Delta Force is stationed at Fort Liberty in North Carolina along with the rest of the Joint Special Operations Command, though the government doesn't officially acknowledge Delta's existence. They were initially codenamed the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, and then the Combat Applications Group. Now they're officially called the Army Compartmented Elements, though they're called Delta Force by civilians. Delta combat personnel are known as operators rather than soldiers. There is perhaps no one more important to Delta Force history than the man who created it, Colonel Charles Beckwith. A native of Georgia, Beckwith was a great athlete who nearly played for the NFL. However, he ended up joining the Army instead and subsequently served during both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. While in Vietnam in the summer of 1965, Beckwith participated in an operation known as Project Delta, which was sort of a precursor to Delta Force.
It was designed to go behind the enemy lines and out where no one was and find these North Vietnamese elements or the Viet Cong.
Project Delta involved collaboration between the U.S. and Vietnamese Special Forces. Beckwith was in charge of Delta, and he tried to model it on a previous Special Forces paper he had written. One of Delta's earliest missions involved Beckwith's team helping rescue besieged Green Berets. The mission was considered a success, resulting in nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers killed. After the war, Beckwith was assigned to study with the British Special Air Services, or SAS, and he wrote a report about their use of special forces. In 1976, when the Army began to consider building their own SAS Special Forces-like unit, they looked at Beckwith and his report. And in January 1977, Beckwith formally pitched the idea of Delta Force as a counter-terrorism unit to his commander. His pitch worked, and on November 19, 1977, Delta Force was officially activated, with Beckwith as the head. Today, Delta Force is considered one of the most elite groups within the U.S. military, but that doesn't mean all of their missions have been successful. In fact, the very first operation they took part in, the attempted rescue of hostages from Iran on April 24, 1980, was a complete and utter disaster. The hostage crisis dated back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and kidnapped dozens of Americans.
The government of Iran must recognize the gravity of the situation which it has itself created.
With negotiations to free them breaking down, U.S. President Jimmy Carter authorized a covert rescue mission, and the task, codenamed Operation Eagle Claw, fell to the practically brand new Delta Force. The initial plan was to fly 118 men into Iran near Tehran, where they would storm the embassy and rescue the hostages. Unfortunately, things were doomed from the beginning when multiple helicopters experienced problems. This caused the mission to be aborted after it had already begun, and in the process, there was a nasty collision between a C-130 aircraft and a helicopter, killing 8 American troops.
Iran must be the only country in the world with a television program on how to tackle American commandos in the street.
The troops quickly got out of the area, but in their haste, they left behind the bodies of their fallen comrades as well as several helicopters. The plan had been to blow them up, but it didn't happen. The hostages remained captive for almost a year more. But even though Delta Force's inaugural mission was a disaster, first impressions wouldn't prove lasting. It's no secret that only the best and most excellent candidates make it into the highly exclusive Delta Force. Much of this has to do with the intense training requirements expected of Delta Force operators.
A small number of people, carefully selected, are preferable to larger numbers of troops, some of whom may not be up to the task.
Around 90% of those who apply will wash out before they make it. While much of their training regime is kept secret, in his book, Colonel Beckwith describes some of the early tests that new recruits had to pass if they wanted a shot at joining. Among these tests was the House of Horrors building. The House of Horrors was a $90,000 complex built to train operators in all sorts of counter-terrorist and hostage rescue tactics. It consisted of 4 rooms that could be mocked up to depict various scenarios, from night assaults to potential aircraft hijackings. It separated the imposters from the real recruits.
Out of my 2 classes of 120 people each, probably 12 to 14 made it.
Apparently, Delta Force took its inspiration for the House of Horrors from the British Special Air Services version of the complex, which the SAS calls the Killing House. The House of Horrors is an extremely rigorous, demanding course built to ensure all Delta Force operators are ready for a myriad of different tasks.
Each of them has been trained in a variety of skills which in more conventional organizations would be distributed among 2 or more individuals.
In 1979, when the State Department was trying to beef up security at several of their foreign embassies, they looked at Colonel Beckwith and his newly established Delta Force for troops. According to one of the recruits, Eric L. Haney, in his autobiography Inside Delta Force, the story of America's elite counter-terrorist unit, selected operators immediately began training to defend U.S. ambassadors from potential threats or unexpected scenarios. These can include a range of things, like getting a flat tire or going to a dinner party that suddenly becomes the target of enemy rocket fire.
All the kinds of things that scare ordinary people to death, these are the kinds of things Delta Force loves to do.
In order to prove they had absorbed their training, Haney and his comrades were put through a unique test. They were given a mysterious envelope with instructions guiding them to meet a series of undercover contacts and/or retrieve more hidden instructions. In addition to having to navigate a city using hidden clues to make things extra tough, their commander told the FBI to be on the lookout for them and begin a manhunt. In the end, Haney and his teammates were able to complete their test, which involved stealing sensitive information from the Naval Observatory, National Guard Armory, and Andrews Air Force Base. They outlasted the FBI, who didn't manage to snag a single one of them, and showed why Delta operators are Delta operators. Since the 1980s, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman Loera has been the scourge of international drug enforcement agencies. As the head of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo helped smuggle untold amounts of drugs through pipelines leading from Central America around the world. He spent much of his life on the run from law enforcement, but he was no match for Delta Force. El Chapo first served prison time in Mexico from 1993 to 2001, but escaped and remained free until 2014 when he was rearrested. He then escaped again while awaiting trial in 2015, but Mexican authorities recaptured him in early 2016. According to an article on SOFREP, Mexican Marines captured El Chapo in 2016 with the help of Delta Force operators. It's alleged that the Delta operators didn't actively participate in the raid, but only provided tactical assistance, which would have still been a pretty significant assist. We'll never know for certain, but El Chapo is now serving life with little chance to escape again, potentially thanks to Delta. Of all the outstanding issues left over from the ill-fated Vietnam War, the controversy of American prisoners of war is one of the thorniest. Officially, the United States and Vietnamese governments hold that following the end of the war and Operation Homecoming, which repatriated 591 American POWs, no other POWs remained in Vietnamese custody. Yet for decades, unofficial rumors have circulated that there were indeed still POWs left behind after the war ended. And apparently there were more than a few rescue missions that nearly took place. At least 2 of the alleged missions involved Delta Force and almost happened in 1981 and 1982, nearly a decade after the end of the war. As former Delta Force operator Haney details in his book, elements of the U.S. government were under the impression that around 125 POWs were being held in neighboring Laos. Delta was called on to initiate the rescue operation, and soon they were having dress rehearsals that involved Air Force pilots. At the last minute, higher-ups scuttled the mission out of fear that the rescue had drawn too much attention. They tried again a year later, but once again the mission was aborted before it could begin. Hopefully the intelligence was bad and there were no POWs, but it's an indication of the wide-ranging mission of Delta Force. The 1983 Beirut embassy bombing was one of the most tragic incidents in American military history. The bombing took place during the Lebanese Civil War, and it was one of the most visible signs of the United States' short-lived involvement. The first U.S. forces had arrived in the country a year earlier as part of a larger international peacekeeping force, and though it was not officially talked about, that included a few Delta Force operators. The suicide bombing occurred on April 18, 1983, and at least 2 Delta Force operators were at the embassy when it happened. One of them, SFC Terry Gilden, was standing outside the embassy and was killed in the blast. The other, Rick Downing, was hurled through a doorway of his office upstairs in the building by the force of the explosion, but managed to survive after being briefly knocked out. After coming to, he organized and assisted in evacuating the American ambassador to safety, before helping to do the same with the remaining wounded and injured. There were 63 victims in the attack, including Gilden, who was later awarded the Army's Legion of Merit. He was a 6-year veteran at the time of his death. Depending on who you ask, the United States invasion of Grenada was either a rousing success or a vulgar display of power against the sovereign nation. The mission, officially known as Operation Urgent Fury, took place on October 19, 1983, following a far left-wing coup by the Military Revolutionary Council. Immediately after the coup, the U.S. invaded, ostensibly to protect U.S. citizens who were students in the country, but in reality to unseat the new radical government. One of the units that participated in Urgent Fury was Delta Force, with 2 squadrons assigned to the mission. B Squadron was tasked with liberating a prison, while A Squadron was ordered to attack an installation after their teammates had completed their mission. But as soon as B Squadron approached their target, their helicopters came under intense enemy fire, causing them to retreat and offload the wounded onto a Navy destroyer. Subsequently, when A Squadron tried to land, they also ran into heavy fire, leaving them to turn around too. One of the team's helicopters crash-landed, resulting in several deaths. While Operation Urgent Fury was a success overall, it was a disastrous outing for Delta Force, and an operation most would probably rather forget. Forever immortalized in the Ridley Scott film Black Hawk Down, the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu is one of Delta Force's most publicly known missions. The battle took place between October 3rd and 4th, 1993, when U.S. forces entered Somalia in an attempt to oust a local warlord who was in control of part of the country. Officially known as Operation Gothic Serpent, Delta Force made up a large contingent to the mission operators. The mission ended tragically, resulting in more than 100 U.S. casualties, 13 UN casualties, and as many as 1,500 Somali deaths. Among the killed in action were Delta operators SFC Randall David Shugart and Master Sergeant Gary Ivan Gordon, who were awarded the Medal of Honor for their heroics during the battle. During the fighting, both Gordon and Shugart volunteered to help secure the site of a U.S. helicopter crash that was in danger of being overrun by militants. Despite knowing that the mission would likely lead to their deaths, the men still volunteered to rescue the fallen pilots.
Gary Gordon and Randall Shugart died in the most courageous and selfless way any human being can act.
They arrived at the crash site without reinforcements, but still managed to hold off the militants for several minutes. Eventually, they ran out of ammunition and succumbed to the attackers, but their courage saved the crashed pilot's life. It was a daring display of heroism and bravery and was undoubtedly worthy of the Medal of Honor they earned. In addition to having an exceedingly cool name, Operation Acid Gambit was one of Delta Force's best missions, even if it's not very widely known. The mission took place on December 20th, 1989 during Operation Just Cause, where the ousting of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega from power. As the head of the military, Noriega had been in charge of Panama since 1983, despite being a former CIA informant.
Noriega served American interests and profited handsomely. CIA Director George Bush gave him a personal tour of the agency.
However, by the late 1980s, he had run afoul of the U.S. government over his illicit drug trafficking and suspected role in the murder of political opponent Hugo Spadafora. In 1988, Noriega was indicted in U.S. court on drug charges, and in early 1989, he had Kurt Muse, an American undercover CIA agent living in Panama, arrested and sent to the infamous La Modelo prison. 9 months later, the U.S. sent in a force 24,000 strong to take Noriega out of power, including Delta Force, whose mission Operation Acid Gambit was to rescue Muse. Under the threat of Muse's execution, Delta operators landed on top of La Modelo and fought their way to his cell while under heavy fire. They rescued him and made their way back out, suffering only 3 casualties and no fatalities. The entire operation was brutally efficient. It took Delta operators 6 minutes to complete the job from start to finish. For most people, compiling a resume is pretty straightforward. You list your basic skills, education, and job experience, including your official role, the name of your company, and superior. But what do you do when your company is classified and the identity of your superior doesn't legally exist? As members of Delta Force can attest, you have to get a little creative.
That's on a need-to-know basis.
Due to the highly secretive and officially classified existence of Delta Force within the military, members can't divulge their official titles and jobs when they fill out resumes or update their LinkedIn pages.
Delta Force doesn't talk much about itself. Indeed, if you talk to the Army, they'll tell you the thing doesn't exist in the first place.
This results in operators giving themselves unique titles that hide their official affiliation, while still giving a nod to their duties and responsibilities. As the Washington Post explains, this leads to some men naming their military detachments things like Special Missions Unit to disguise their real name. And once they get an interview, there are strict limits on what they can even talk about in relation to their Delta history because so much of it needs to stay secret. And after all, most interviewers won't just believe you if you say your work history is highly classified. It's an interesting tightrope current and former Delta members have to walk, and one that most people probably don't even think about. Since the early 1990s, Delta Force operators have fought against deadly forces in Iraq. They fought in the 1991 Persian Gulf War and again during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, after which they remained in the country until 2011. However, they returned once more in 2014 in response to the new threat from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, which started the fighting all over again. On October 22, 2015, Delta Force operators participated in a prison rescue operation in Hawija, which resulted in the rescue of 70 prisoners from ISIL militants. During the rescue, however, a Delta operator, Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler, was killed. Originally, the raid was to be undertaken by Kurdish fighters, and the Delta operators were just there to observe. Yet when things started to go south, Wheeler and the other Delta operators jumped in to lend a hand. They soon took charge of the assault into the prison, which led to Wheeler's death.
Kurdish forces inside the compound were overwhelmed. The U.S. commander made the decision to enter the firefight.
Wheeler was the first U.S. soldier killed in the year since American forces began fighting again in Iraq. No American had died there since 2011, when the military had previously pulled out, making Wheeler's death even more tragic. Wheeler was awarded a posthumous Silver Star for his actions. It was the beginning of the end for Saddam Hussein when U.S. forces invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003, but it was Delta Force operators who delivered the final blow 9 months later. In response to accusations of harboring weapons of mass destruction and illegally selling oil while under United Nations sanctions, the U.S. stormed Iraq in early 2003 with the explicit intention of permanently removing Hussein from power. Unfortunately, even though they were successful in ousting him from office and ending his murderous dictatorship, U.S. forces didn't immediately capture the man himself. In July, they killed 2 of his sons, Uday and Qusay, but their father still eluded his captors. Then, in December, members of the secretive Task Force 121 found him near Tikrit. Task Force 121 was made up of several special forces units, including Delta Force. Known as Operation Red Dawn, Task Force 121 raided a farm just south of Tikrit, acting upon intelligence from a captured Hussein confidant. Members of Task Force 121 found a disheveled Hussein hiding in a hole on the farm. He had been on the run for 9 months.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
They immediately took him into custody, and he was executed almost exactly 3 years later. It wouldn't be the last time Delta Force operated within Iraq, but it was definitely one of the most important, if largely unknown, missions. For many years, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was among the most feared men in the entire world. As the head of ISIL, al-Baghdadi was one of the biggest enemies on American intelligence radar. And in 2019, when the U.S. finally caught up to him after years of failed attempts, it was none other than Delta Force who arrived on his doorstep. Initially, al-Baghdadi came to American attention during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when he was briefly detained over his ties to his militant brother-in-law. However, he was inexplicably released in 2004, and by 2010 had declared himself the head of ISIL's caliphate in Iraq. The Obama administration tried and failed to capture al-Baghdadi, and it wasn't until 2019 that the CIA was able to assist in locating him, partly through interrogating one of his wives. Delta Force commanders, along with at least one military dog, assaulted the compound where al-Baghdadi was hiding on October 27, 2019. According to then-President Donald Trump, the operators tracked him to an underground tunnel, and he blew himself and some of his children up with a suicide vest to prevent himself from being captured. Initial reports identified Delta Force's involvement, but military officials never officially acknowledged their participation, which isn't exactly surprising. Of all of Delta Force's missions, one of the most important took place during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, when the U.S. forces invaded Iraq to stop their occupation of neighboring Kuwait.
The United States strongly condemns the Iraqi military invasion of Kuwait.
While the Gulf War is a well-studied event, most people don't realize that Delta Force played an important role in stopping the war from expanding. Beginning just days after the U.S. began their invasion, Saddam Hussein authorized the launching of Scud ballistic missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia. This resulted in the death of at least 13 Israelis and injuries to 77 Saudis, and almost brought Israel into the war to take on Hussein. Hussein likely theorized that bringing the Israelis into the conflict would fracture the international coalition, which included some Arab states, giving him a better chance of survival. At first, the U.S. was unable to knock out the Scuds, and Hussein kept firing them into Israel. This threatened to drastically change the war, but President George H.W. Bush managed to convince Israel to stay out. Finally, on February 27, 1991, Hussein planned a final barrage of 26 Scuds meant to tip Israel's hand. But Delta operators located all of the 26 missiles and neutralized them before they could be activated. Like most of their accomplishments, the public never heard about their contribution, but without Delta, the Middle East might be drastically different today. The Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl exchange was one of the most controversial and contentious prisoner swaps in history, and Delta Force was right in the thick of it. Bergdahl, a former U.S. Army sergeant, is infamous for his 2009 capture by Taliban militants while he was stationed in Iraq. It occurred after he had voluntarily and illegally vacated his post on the front lines, and he wound up being imprisoned by the Taliban for almost 5 years. During his time in captivity, Bergdahl was tortured at the hand of his captors. In 2014, the United States swapped Bergdahl for some Taliban members who were in the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. Due to the dangerous, high-profile nature of the swap, the Army tapped Delta Force to take part in the exchange. Thankfully, things went off without a hitch, and Bergdahl was quickly flown out of the area by Delta operators who brought him back to a U.S. base for the first time in years.
Their son, Bowe, is coming home.
I believe his exact words were, "Bob, Janny, we have him."
Had things gone south, few units would have been better prepared to take on the Taliban fighters than Delta Force. As for Bergdahl, he was dishonorably discharged from the Army in 2017, though his court-martial was overturned in 2023. By late 1992, the manhunt for notorious drug trafficking kingpin Pablo Escobar was operating at full steam. Escobar was infamous as the head of the Medellin cartel, one of the biggest drug trafficking organizations in the world.
Escobar was to cocaine what Ford was to automobiles.
Escobar himself had become an extremely rich man on the back of the profits, but he was wanted by law enforcement everywhere. He surrendered to Colombian authorities in June 1991, but easily escaped their custody just a year later. With Escobar on the run again, the Colombian government enlisted the help of the U.S. to track him down and bring him to justice. They wanted Delta Force to do the tracking, and President George Bush authorized the deployment of an 8-man force to Colombia. They called the mission Operation Heavy Shadow, and it ended with a bullet to Escobar's brain, courtesy of an American sniper. In his 2001 book Killing Pablo, The Hunt for the World's Greatest Outlaw, author Mark Bowden theorized that it may have even been a Delta operator who fired the fatal shot due to its precision.
Don't get asked to assassinate Pablo Escobar unless you've got the right experience.
However, the Delta commander that day, Colonel Jerry Boykin, has officially denied the possibility, though it's impossible to say for sure. Either way, Delta played a huge role in Escobar's death, even if they didn't pull the final trigger. 17 seconds. That's how long it took for Delta Force operators to storm an Iraqi militant complex and rescue 4 hostages. The raid took place on June 8, 2004, at the height of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The hostages, a mix of Italian and Polish contractors, had been kidnapped from Baghdad months earlier, and one of them, an Italian, had been killed by the militants in a grisly execution caught on videotape. After an agonizingly long search, Special Forces intelligence led Delta operators to a complex where it was believed the hostages were being held. With little time to spare, the Delta operators boarded helicopters and were on their way to the compound to break them out. In less than a minute, the operators took the entire building and had all 4 of the surviving hostages in tow. Incredibly, Delta pulled off the entire operation in broad daylight, which only adds to their impressive reputation. Few teams could have pulled off the rescue with the precision and skill of Delta, but that's what makes them truly elite.